Hello, everyone. Welcome to Centering Justice, or as we affectionately call it, CJ. Hopefully, as you're transitioning in, you sit down, get comfy, take a deep breath in to bring you into space. My name is, and release it, and keep breathing too. My name is Hamida Bagarathi, pronoun she, her, hers, and I'm joined by my co-conspirators, Yodeep Meskin Johnson, new CEO and president, Carly, Frederick, our program manager, and Jill of all trades, just incredible. And we are joined today by a speaker collaborator, Karen Tyler-Ruiz, pronoun she, her, the executive director of the Center for Community-Based Enterprise. So welcome to my apartment in Ypsilanti, and I'm joining you today from Ypsilanti on unceded and occupied lands of the three council fires of Michigan, Sauk and Fox and Wyandotte, and land in which contemporary Indigenous peoples continue to live and thrive and contribute to our and their collective uplift. I'll also note that our Native American Indigenous siblings have long practiced ways of organizing. And today, we'll be drawing upon different ways in our ancestors and histories to think about how we imagine ourselves as a bunch of different folks and people, but are collected and together and hopefully move as one large interconnected organism. So what brings us here today? You may have been with us when at the very top way last year, ages ago, we talked about how we heal. We just concluded a chapter on talking about how we share leadership. And now for this chapter, we're going to think about how we come together. I think we sort of softly landed on how we organize, but organizing doesn't actually hold all the complexities that we're seeking to explore. We're thinking about how we come together, like how we share leadership and how we heal, but also like how we collectively lead. So we're going to hang out with a little bit with how we organize. And we're going to be spending some time April through June on that. And today we have Karen Tyler-Ruiz, who will be helping us think about why should our organizations become worker-led organizations or unionized? And how are the structures of organizations transforming to build power, joy, resilience, and justice? And in the past, we've talked about sort of like the theories or like what we could do. And Karen is here to help us think about, so what is already happening to transform the ways that we come together and that we lead together. So who is Karen Tyler-Ruiz? Karen Tyler-Ruiz serves as the executive director of the Center for Community-Based Enterprises, Inc. in Detroit, Michigan. C2BE, as it's called, supports the creation of people-centered businesses, cooperatives, community, and worker-owned enterprises, where worker owners and members have a democratic say in all financial and strategic decisions, i.e., they have a say in their own future. Tyler-Ruiz has spent the last 20 years of her career catalyzing community wealth building collaborations in programs and building practical frameworks and strategies in support of Detroiters and Metro Detroiters. Her goal is for local individuals and families to be able to work, earn, and be housed with dignity while enjoying a good and sustainable quality of life to live, work, and play within their community. Tyler-Ruiz has experience leading and supporting economic mobility opportunities in workforce development, personal finance, affordable housing, and currently through cooperative businesses. She is the principal consultant of Tyler-Ruiz and Associates, LLC, and is fully bilingual in English and Spanish with significant international work experiences. So Karen, so excited, grateful, thankful to have you here with us. I'm going to pass it off to Yodeep, though, to bring her voice into the space and offer us some grounding for how we'll spend our time.
Thanks, Amita. Thanks all of you for being here. I'm going to begin with honor for a friend and beloved community member, Jude Walton, who died tragically last week. And when I was thinking about Jude and her teachings around cultural humility, public accountability, and what it means for us to see housing as a human right and not a privilege, I'm invoking her spirit in this space. And I share with her radical dreams for Washtenaw County and really everywhere to be a place where each of us not only survives, but thrives. So, Jude, we love you and our hearts are broken, but she has left surely an indelible impression in the hearts of many and in the community for sure. I will count her as a new ancestor that I know by name. And I would offer that I know many in our community are hurting. So we also extend our love and care to any of you here for whom that might be the case. I'm going to transition to bringing us into space. And first of all, I'm geeked. Karen is here. Been sort of following Karen around and loving how she moves. But to get us started, writer Sidra Morgan Montoya, who I've quoted here before, I love her work, in her essay, The Nonprofit Industrial Complex 101, a primer on how it upholds inequity and flattens resistance. She reminds us that to imagine new worlds, we need new words that reflect our current one. That our ancestor Audre Lorde tells us that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. This is why there's such a proliferation of new language, especially among progressive-minded folks, because we're describing forces we have purposefully been given no words to describe. New words are what's needed to talk about gender and race and identity, new words to talk about diversity of internal experience, new words to talk about the oppressive ways that society is organized. And together we create these new words to describe the truths we know deeply and simply have not yet heard someone else speak. For me, 20 years ago, one of those words was the nonprofit industrial complex. And I'm hearing it more and more and more often. The framework for the nonprofit industrial complex was inspired by a radical group of activists and feminists at an organization called Incite. Their anthology, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, gathers essays from radical activists, educators, and nonprofit staff from around the globe who critically rethink the long-term consequences of this framework. There's a substantial amount of idealism in our mainstream imagination when it comes to nonprofits. National organizations say our sector embodies the rest of America. And frankly, that is true in some ways. Our organizations do provide a way for people to work together towards common good and to transform our shared beliefs and hopes into action. Often, though, nonprofits are held up as the pathway to a better world, a better place. But the truth is messier. And that is because of the nonprofit industrial complex. It's sort of like we're setting off to explore the wilderness of radical change, only to realize that we're in a man-made hedge maze that leads in one direction. Each bend of that maze is erected by a network of public and private entities, including the state, businesses, individuals, and nonprofits ourselves, who make decisions that uphold the power each of us has in society. And in this case, the state refers to various arms of government and their role in maintaining society, including its oppressive principles. These entities and the way the relationships between them work often advance their interest rather than the public good. And together we are making up or comprising the nonprofit industrial complex. And within that, the structures of big philanthropy make it easy for nonprofits to become more invested in the funder's agenda than in the agendas of the communities we serve. Merle Beam, author of Gay Inc., The Nonprofitization of Queer Politics, described the effects of this on the goals of queer liberation activism as a movement that had become more and more reliant on a small number of wealthy donors and corporations and private philanthropy. And the goals of the movement began to shift to align more with what those funders would prioritize. So she asked, why gay marriage? Because rich people wanted it ultimately, and they drove the agenda of the movement with their donations. And that's just one example of how this labyrinth of philanthropy, the state, government, nonprofits conspire together to impact nonprofits and how we work and funneling our work in certain directions while walling off others. It turns radical possibilities into dead ends at times, y'all, ensuring that the path of least resistance is one that doesn't challenge power, amplifies corporate and state interests, and does that over the voices of often of people most impacted by inequities. So this month, when I began to draft New's 10-year vision, I wrote, we have continued to initiate progressive change in the field, including breaking new ground, new creative ground within nonprofit leadership, governance, and guidance. And we also have continued to renew our own approaches to our mission and vision. Our ethos, our structure, practices, and work have positioned us ultimately to impact change and influence the ecosystem. People like me, people in radical nonprofits, we want to do good. And we get into this work hoping to find a constructive avenue for our desires to fight for racial, economic, gender justice, and more, to imagine new futures. Often, the nonprofit and industrial complex blocks this. It incentivizes top-down approaches and imposes often the agendas of the wealthy on how we work. We know that that system isn't viable, and we remain deeply reflective at New on our role and on our accountability for changing it. So here we are. Here we find ourselves today, as we often are, with curious minds and also hope in our heart. What if how we organized ourselves in this sector currently wasn't the only path to justice, freedom, and the collaboration we long for? We're curious, are there other ways to organize that we should consider? I tend to think so. Karen is somebody, as I said, that I've admired for a really long time, and I'm delighted that we get a chance to have this initial conversation with Karen to talk about her work and the legacy she's building on. Thanks for being here, Karen.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
What an incredible grounding. I think about sort of like our why and some of the traditions of how the nonprofit, charity, benevolence, whatever we want to gravitate to, our reason for existence. And to think about that was past in history. But there's that future piece of how we create anew.
Mhm.
And something that Hillary Watson, one of our coworkers, said this morning. And at first glance, I was like, girl, that's a wild comment. And then I was like, actually, I hear that. But fascism really romanticizes the beauty of the past,
Mhm.
and doesn't really create space or hope or even an option for really incredible futures. And I think, Karen, some of the stuff you're doing, I certainly has blown my mind. I am ready. I have some pen and paper here for inevitably, like my brain breaks. I'm so excited. But for folks who have been to CJ before, really thinking about the ways that we are entering into a conversation, into a space, the multiple personal, social, other identities that we hold inform how we think about the world. Think about how we kind of proceed through our work and our lives. So, Karen, if you could, kind of come in and share what you're bringing into this space, some of the communities and identities that you're drawing upon as you enter into and join and drive this conversation with us today.
Thank you for that. This is amazing grounding. I'm taking notes myself for our webinars. I am a Black American female born and raised in Detroit, have lived in other places, cities, states, and countries. I'm cis, female, hetero, married, 2 kids. I am bilingual, so spending a lot of time outside of the United States. I worked, I studied, I worked, I got married, I had a child all outside of the United States. So I have a big chunk of that really has informed my view of our culture, our society, our nation, in addition to all that I brought with it growing up. So that's in a nutshell, a little bit about who I am and what I'm bringing in.
Thanks for sharing that. A question that this season that we've been asking every one of our guests, Karen, is to share a story of transformation. One of the moments you knew that your ways of being or working had forever changed. Can you tell us a time that happened for you?
Sure.
One of
There's
your stories of transformation.
exactly. There's several, but here's one that I think really it was powerful to me. I worked at a CDFI many years ago.
Community Development Financial Institution.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Which
It's
provides
okay.
grants
Yeah.
and loans to community-based organizations. And I was at a conference, don't remember which one it was, but it was during the reign of rain. The Alan Greenspan was at the Fed, leading the Fed at that time. So, and I was involved in some affordable housing in some way, shape, or form. So I walked into one of the rooms they had where this meeting was. It was it was a government entity, and I looked up on this big board on the wall, had the whole US and Michigan, and then in Detroit was all grayed out. This is 2004, and I was looking at that, and I'm like, what is this? And so I read all the notes, and it said the number of subprime mortgages. So all of Detroit was grayed out. This is 2004. So you know what happened, 2006, 7, 8, when everything started crashing. And that was really a wake-up call to me that not at the time, but when we went into the crash, our government knew that was going to happen. It was actually mapped out and where it would hit hardest. And nothing was done to try and head it off the way we do for the big banks all the time. So it really made me think, wow, maybe our government isn't always looking out for our interests as the little guy. It was overwhelming and very powerful to me. It really did incite my passions to do more.
Listen, honey, I was like, you think?
I spent a lot of time in my youth thinking about like the government still has a place, and I'm older now. Let me just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did that experience make you move different, or that sort of aha revelatory moment?
It really made me want to figure out how to make sure we could keep money, how to support keeping average people's money in pockets, right? Keep other people's hands out of your pocket. That could be government. Actually, it's a lot of corporations. It's all of the above. And I have been focused on that in different ways. The personal finance piece was one of the first ones. The Centers for Community-Based, no, I'm sorry, the Centers for Working Families that I worked on when I was at the CDFI. Access to financial coaches at that time was a new concept. So, the rich have many advisors, but the average Joe has nothing. And so it was a way to begin to address it. It was a start, right? And it's just kept going. So every step I've taken really has been, okay, what else can I do? Okay, all right, economic and jobs, did that, workforce. But I understood very quickly that our system was not empowering, or if you like, I don't know that word, it wasn't necessarily supporting the interests of the average person. It was supporting the interests of corporations and employers.
Yeah, we refer to that as like the ruling class elite, right? Whatever that
Right.
looks like, or the 1% or the 10% or what have you. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. And of course, that gap has widened even since 2004 when you were at that conference with Greenspan.
Yes. So many reasons why that is. that,
I know
that,
as a fellow Detroiter myself, seeing that grade out had to hit you in the heart too.
it absolutely did when we came to realize the impact of it, because at that time I did not understand what was ahead of us. I really didn't. But I remembered that because it was just so incredible once we were in that path, and I was working in the organization trying to put your finger in the hole when the dike was about to break.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was just, there was a lot there. Living through all of that personally in my own life, it had an impact on my family in addition to seeing it in our communities. Yeah, it was impactful.
And I think you referred to it, but I want to be explicit. We're talking about the recession in 2006, 7,
the
8, and
housing bubble that
the
burst.
housing bubble, all of, yeah, right.
Mhm, mhm.
And the amount of loss of not only, property, but connection as a result of that was astounding. And people monetized on that later, if you think about where Detroit is now.
Oh, absolutely. We talk about the
Mhm.
percentage of homeowners now. That had a huge impact on the percentage of homeowners in Detroit. I honestly think about that period as the great theft. That's how I think about it
Mm.
for us.
Ooh,
So,
it had to be, yeah, that's a
yeah.
defining and transforming moment. Yeah, yeah, wow.
Uh,
Karen, I mean, and when you talk about theft, I think about it's not only property, it's opportunity. I think about sort of like collateral damage, but like families, cohesion. Wow. So this transformative moment that you talked about way back when in 2004, now you're the executive director for C2BE. Could you help us like make a connection between sort of like, what drew you to that org or to that work? And then tell us a little bit about C2BE.
sure. Again, as I said, keeping money in people's pockets. How can we do that? How can you support? Was involved, workforce development in that space, and then began to see that it was a lot that was in support of the employers making decisions about who would be in that space and how they came into that space. And so I wasn't satisfied with that. Getting folks into good jobs wasn't enough. Um, and I really started thinking about people's agency, and making decisions, their own decisions. Again, this isn't like rocket science, but it just impacted me. So that led me to C2BE, which is an organization in support of cooperatives or community-based enterprises, as we call them, that folks have an agency inside of them. It's about entities. And for the most part, we're talking about for-profits. Our nonprofit that I work for is primarily focused on for-profits, but for-profits that are sharing power through democratic ownership of some sort and governance, through sharing of revenues, and on the flip side, when things don't go well, and being a part of that. That's where I am now at C2BE. And so our organization really is in the business of trying to either create those entities from scratch. And I would say even more is talking with business owners that currently exist. Doesn't matter who they are. Primarily, well, we're in Metro Detroit. I'll start. We also now are doing some work in Ingham County that's fairly new. And then seeing if they would like to sell their business, something they usually have never considered, out to their employees, because then you have more employee owners that own a business and then have agency that, and then we support them in, our country does not teach you how to work and share. That's not who we are. It's dominated by, even in entrepreneurship, you got the hero worship of the hero entrepreneur. And you want to be the next, God forbid, Elon Musk. And then we push that agenda, as opposed to you can actually own something together. You can pool your thoughts and your thinking and the lift it takes to get something off the ground. You can fill a hole that the market has overlooked, but can work for your community. You can actually make revenue and then decide how you're gonna use that revenue, and it stays in your community, as well as in your pocket, and it gets recycled, you know. So that's the walk, and that's where I am right now, because I just think it's a wonderful way, frankly, for just self-determined agency and agency, is if you are a worker owner, not just a sole entrepreneur running around doing everything, trying to figure it all out, is like, do it in community, right where you are, creating something perhaps that you see that's missing in your community. It's doable. As I just tap into, when I was living outside the United States, this type of shared ownership, cooperatives, different names, is normal. It's like air people breathe in other countries, where in the United States, although we have some infrastructure supporting it, it's just not as well known, particularly in the urban sectors. And particularly Michigan and Detroit are not in the forefront in this spaces. So that was a long answer to your question.
Well, that's really helpful, Karen, because I think about what has become the dominant narrative of what business looks like who profit is for, who is able to lead organizations, and what that coalescing looks like. It is a very sort of traditional, whatever traditional means, but rooted in American and in many ways white supremacist culture ideals. And it's really important that I really appreciated you brought up like different perspectives, especially in your international experience. But I imagine also folks who are not the dominant identities, or folks who hold marginalized identities. There are already these ideas floating around in the US domestically, but they're not the ones necessarily sort of like in power, or sort of like running this ecosystem of the nonprofit sector.
Yes, that is correct. And again, our organization is a nonprofit. So just saying that out loud. I have shared with others, I'll share here, that the founder of our organization, in trying to still have a nonprofit, but make it more similar to what we are trying to achieve. Our bylaws are not traditional bylaws that you might see in a nonprofit. In part is there's the board in the bylaws. It says once the organization, which at the time it was written, there were no employees, has, I think it's 2 employees. For every 2 employees, then one employee gets voted on to the board, so that there's employee voice there. And as executive director, I have voice on the board, where typically that's not the case in most nonprofits. So that was a sort of a first step to try and walk the walk that we're trying to actually promote. Just sharing, since that time, there's been a whole movement of self-directed nonprofits, and we've actually looked at that. Some groups have done that. We have made a decision right now. We are continuing to look at that. We decided not to do it right this moment, because we're still in a big capacity growth spurt right now. And so that would be trying to, eat the whole elephant at once. But we're looking at that as a possibility down the road. But that gets back into the whole power dynamic. And also it is incrementalism. So you can, I have feelings on that, and the big break. I think they're both in play right now.
Now that resonates deeply, Karen, and I also somewhat had my mind blown by the idea of staff on board, except there are examples of that. I still floated it to our board last night, and I appreciate the renewed inspiration, and want to shout out also the work of the Ontario Nonprofit Network. Their research on reimagining governance is a huge gift to the field in terms of thinking about the ways that we can, for now, stay compliant with our IRS obligations, while also structuring our boards. And this is the important piece that you're speaking of, structuring them in such a way where power is not hoarded, but can be shared and can be ceded where necessary. And that's it. That is an important part of, beyond philanthropy, an important challenge and opportunity that we have in the field, to think about the way our boards are structured. There was a lot that you said there in that last bit, including agency. And we've been thinking and talking about agency a lot. And especially on the heels of, I think, a big push around representation, which is super important too, but merely moving people into positions or roles or titles, but not equipping them with power, with agency, with decision-making ability, falls short of what we need to really reorganize ourselves. So there's reorganizing happening in the organization, right? And how can we do that? We've been thinking a lot at New, and last episode, we had folks that were experimenting with shared leadership models. Now this expansion to thinking about the actual structure and designation of our organizations from boards, et cetera. What would you say delineates a community-based enterprise or a cooperative from a nonprofit? Karen,
So we
what distinguishes them?
yeah, community-based enterprise, the way we look at that is any sustainable, locally rooted business, for-profit business is what we're talking about. So we're in the business of creating for-profits. We have worked with some nonprofits, but like a community-based entity will work with them, usually to create some type of revenue generating thing that's community owned, right? We're not in the business of building a nonprofit, but it's locally rooted, provides equity ownership for workers and producers, pays living wages, and then shares resources to help each other grow. So that we want the CBEs to work with other CBEs or cooperatives. So I say that because sometimes folks actually, a lot of times come and ask us about starting a nonprofit when that's not the business that we're in, because we are thinking about agency, and again, there's no one right way. It's that revenue generation, so that there's financial reward for doing whatever it is that you're going to try and do in community, sharing the power, sharing the resources, sharing the decision making, and sharing when times go bad. During the pandemic, we kept our eye on all the data around cooperatives, and cooperatives did much better than traditional businesses, because particularly worker-owned cooperatives, because you are making decisions, right? You are the owner and the worker, so you can determine how you're gonna do whatever you need to do to respond. So many co-ops we saw brought down their time in whatever industry that they were working in. They decided together in different places, like we know who works here. We are gonna decide that this person who's got 3 kids needs more hours than I do. I mean, but it's at that level, so you can make the kind of decisions that you want. And so a lot of those businesses that are cooperatives, community owned, they did not go out of business, and or they didn't have to lose all their staff, because they figured out a way to keep everybody engaged and involved, so that when the market came back, then they could just continue to work and just come back up. Many of them pivoted, doing what they were doing in that minute, just to make sure that they could stay afloat, but still they made the decisions. Everybody was involved in it. And so there's a lot of data out there about how much better folks fared. And frankly, I have friends in other countries, same thing. Like most countries did not have what the United States felt with this massive laying off and people losing jobs. Yes, people did lose jobs, but because of different countries, because of how they're structured, a lot of folks, they might have not worked for a little bit, and now they're working again in the same place, in the same job. So it's just
there's like wow, 2 strands here for me. Like, I think that we have been socialized into these either or, like you're either a capitalist or an anti-capitalist, right? And some of us who are in between, I'll speak for myself. What I find difficult is like, that is the currency and the resource that we're primarily working with to, eat our food, or to, acquire land or property. And while I am open to exploring new models of that, like growing my own food, it's not practical for me today, right? So my particular practice around conscious capitalism, if you will, is where am I buying from and am I investing locally, et cetera. And what I'm hearing is a similar set of values among these owner operators, owner workers is, yes, we need money to grow these tomatoes or, this product that we're making or what have you, but our relationship to that and to our workers is not one of extraction.
Right.
How wealthy can the owner get, but one that is regenerating dollars throughout the entity and throughout the community. Am I gathering that if so, that really aligns to this study of just transition this journey of study of just transition we've been on. Did I lose you?
No, I'm still
It's
here.
just checking, so there's a value system that undergirds some of how folks that are choosing this path.
Yeah, there is, again, at the center of it still, I think it is just self-determination and agency. I'm saying that over and over.
Mutuality, maybe?
Mutuality. I'm gonna use another, this is not our work, but I'm gonna point to the Detroit People's Food Co-op. I'm a member, just like many other people.
Me too.
If you're not, tell people about it. Anyway, I'm just a member. I talk about that because I watched all of that work from afar, and it is the co-op that's being built was not an end game for Baba Malik Yukini and any of that. It was a process of engaging people. There's food sovereignty. I'm just sharing it. This is not my gig. I'm just sharing it because it's about engaging folks in their own self-determination, coming back to the land, getting involved, learning how to grow. And then you can create the cooperative is an opportunity again for shared experience of an economy, Black-led, and that it could potentially be, now this is where I'm talking out of turn for sure, where growers that are local can also bring something to market, right? That's ideal, that would be in that space. So that if you think about that, I do, because my grandfather back in the 1930s actually was out forming co-ops, and my grandma was forming daycare centers back when that wasn't a thing. And the whole point was aggregating the food that Black folks where he was had little plots of land, so they couldn't, there's always the barter thing, but they could also bring stuff to market together in a co-op structure, right? Producer co-op, to sell aggregately and then distribute, because that one person growing their beans and that one person growing their corn couldn't do it alone, but together they could. So this is the concept in there. So there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot. And so those values of community, of communal, the sharing together, how you get to thriving, not sustenance or just, no, thriving, and even back then, I mean, I think about this, these are stories that I carry in my head that my aunts and uncles and mom told me. It's funny how clearly there was Jim Crow and all of the above, but they didn't look at it the way we do, because there was this whole communal thing going on, both economically as well as communities. So that can take me down a whole other path, but all of that's embedded in there. And I'm going back, I'll come back to the Detroit People's Food Co-op. The wonderful thing about that is it's visible. And so I'm gonna say thank you to Baba Malik, because it actually means more people are seeing something that they can see, touch, and feel. And then they start asking about co-ops. And so it lifts everybody up to just start having this conversation. So hats off.
Karen and Yoji, you've sparked so many ideas now that I had a question and then it changed and then I decided I didn't like it. Now I'm coming back to it. So, I mean, Yoji, we started off with thinking about, I think I felt some moment about like when you were talking about capitalist, anti-capitalist. And then I same as I reacted with Hillary to that quotation I started us off with. I think there are many ways in which we're like betwixt and between. I feel like there's a mini question I want to ask, and then there's like a follow-up question
Let's
because
do it.
there's so much good stuff to like what you're talking about in terms of agricultural work and farming, and also like legacy and history. I feel like that's very complicated. So Karen, when you were talking about economy, I feel like that word has changed so many times, right? Like what I perceive is that there was this like economy of the past that's like shifted, and like today's economy, whatever that means, like isn't quite for everybody who exists today. And so, I'm really curious if you could talk about like sort of like economy and kind of like how that's related. And yeah, I'll just stop there.
Yeah. So the economy, right, how you define it. So the way we define it nationally, you hear people talking about GDP, gross domestic product. A lot of numbers you hear about the Wall Street and what's happening there. There's a disconnect between that and me, I'll say, representing us, because that's sort of now almost an asset economy, right? Where we're making money off of making money. And I am used to when you talk about back then, what was happening back then, yes, in the 30s and 40s of the last century, the economy really was made up of producing things, of growing things, of selling things. And in many cases, they were right there in your community. We've moved to now where everything's corporatized. A few people own a lot of things. And frankly, what we are now to the economy is simply labor and a consumer. But we're not benefiting from the economy. Those are the only roles that have been created for us, right? And that's been a steady drumbeat in our country, and picked up in the 80s. There's a whole lot there too. But that's what I think of. So the economy that this word that we use as economy now writ large in the nation is not the economy writ small that I'm talking about in terms of figuring out how to recreate, or not even recreate, because that means going back, create an economy that we can all participate in together, and not dependent on others. And I'm not just a consumer, right? I'm part of something. I'm there's a lot of places for me to be. And this gets at the self-sufficiency and the agency and self-determination, because then you can figure out the direction you want to take it, how much you want to make. Most of us would love to be a worker owner and make enough so that our families thrive really well. Most of us don't want to be billionaires. There are always one or two, but most of us don't. So there's a lot of room for that. It's not a lot of room when you want to create a whole bunch of billionaires, because that's going to be this many billionaires and a lot of us having to buy stuff and work for you and extract from me.
Yeah. I'm just so struck, Karen, in the way that you talk about like we are laborers and consumers, but I feel there are so many like crucial missing parts in that. And I feel my second disjointed question was around, I really appreciated the way you started talking about how farmers are forming co-ops kind of in Detroit, and thinking about what it means to have multiple farmers like working to create something that isn't like machine created, machine driven. I show up to my insert corporate grocery here. Could you talk a little bit about sort of like, how that's developing, and kind of like share a little bit more, go deeper?
Sure. I'll do a little bit in terms of historically, the United States really took a deep dive into co-op policy after the 1929 market crash. So at that time, similar to now, there was a lot of upheaval because so many people were thrown into unemployment, lost their savings, that people were pissed and wanted a new way of doing things. So many laws were enacted and because at that time we were moving into the industrial age, but we were still primarily agrarian in agriculture. So a lot of the laws are embedded in the United States inside of the USDA, the Department of Agriculture. So there's co-op supports, money for co-op centers all throughout the United States in that space, and much less so for urban areas. And I say that because there's a lot of actually agricultural co-ops out there that you may not even recognize or know about. So you think about, like I said, the aggregation of milk. The dairy farmers have a co-op to help sell their milk. Land O'Lakes Butter, that is a co-op for marketing butter together with the dairy farmers again. Ocean Spray, that is another market and producer co-op that the farmers came together. So they, exactly, that's the aggregation thing.
They all out in that lake in the cranberries, all of them.
They're all producing it, but they one brand, all those farmers are, that's how they do it. And so that's where we see it most policy wise in the United States. Locally, I think, like I said, the Detroit People's Food Co-op is a very, like a nice small right here version of something getting started like that. And there's a lot of local farming going on in Detroit. There's CSAs, and I'm gonna forget them. Basically, you can order
community supported agriculture.
Thank you. Yes,
I got you. We got you.
Box, you know, when it comes to your house, because that's right there, and that money's recirculated. This is that through line to what it looks like for us in the urban environment. So, and also the historical part. So right now, frankly, historically, where we are is in a good place to again push on policy levers to create what we're trying to create. That's one path.
Go ahead with your follow-up, Amita. Can I check for understanding? It sounds like, and my mind is a little bit blown because I think the story I was telling myself is that co-ops, even though I knew about when you said the milk co-op, I knew about that. But like, as I talk about it in more contemporary circles, I think it's like, we have to remember how our ancestors built these things outside of these systems that were locking them out, right? So it's
Right.
still jives with the agency piece, the self-determination, all of that you mentioned, right. And of course the work of and you recently shouted out Fannie Lou Hamer and some other organizers. But when you reminded us about this co-op policy coming out of the 1929 market crash, it's like, right, it was a financial resiliency strategy, right? It makes you more resilient. It's essentially the same as daycare co-ops, I wonder, I guess I'm speculating that as we as a population, we're building economic resilience, that is a threat to folks who are still interested in hoarding wealth. And that cuts across some of the identities or even the identity politics of who's building or where our co-ops being built, and really speaks to how we can work harmoniously together to build power and agency across lines of difference, right? And I have said in the past on this podcast, like, I don't think my house phone when I was a kid was in our name until I was well into my teens. There was that was one of the ways in which folks shared resource and wealth. Or I can remember my mother hosting card parties and rent parties where there was this pooling or cooperative and
Right.
mutual. And then when you talk about, we are all enamored with Baba Malik's work at the co-op, but that regenerative economy, it makes a lot of sense. From a business perspective, if I'm working cooperatively with 3 other organizations to manage our back office, if one of us is in trouble, everybody's not, we don't have to go down. So there's value proposition beyond just there's a business case beyond the values proposition, and a history and legacy. Land O'Lakes, who knew? I've been buying struggle butter for forever. Who knew? Who knew?
Oh, go ahead, Karen.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Dee, you got me thinking like what it means um, to know that our ancestors, and there are many different places across the globe and across generations, organized. And I think about last chapter, we talked about like shared leadership and leading. But one thing that comes to mind is that like for me, sometimes, I mean, we're not always in a main leadership role. Like Karen, I'd love to hear, talking about what it means to sort of like being a good member. And y'all, I will admit that in a prior conversation with Karen, I realized there were some ways I was inadvertently ceding power as a member because I just
Right.
wasn't doing it. So I'd love to hear you talk about that, Karen.
Yeah, we all do that. And I do not hold myself up as, I'm doing everything right. But one of the things I recall talking about is that the credit unions are also cooperatives. And in many cases, we've kind of forgotten about that. And that's in part because they've been trying to compete with the banking industry. They're a financial institution, but they are not a bank. And the reason why they're not a bank is because they're structured as a co-op, which means you having a deposit account there, whatever kind you have, means you have a share because you are a member. And when I was a kid, because my mom had us all open our accounts when we were 12, and at that, I'm a member of the Michigan First, which used to be called the Detroit Teachers Cooperative Co-op Union. It was we called our accounts were called shares. So you had a share account, a checking account, and then a share savings account. But we use that language to keep us connected to what it meant to be part of a co-op. And frankly, now that I think about it, my mom, she had us involved in lots of co-ops. We got our eyeglasses at Co-op Optical. Do you remember that? That's a cooperative as well. So those things were much more conscious then, because I think there's an opportunity, and I'm calling out credit unions right now. There's an opportunity to retake that agency and empower. I don't like that word. And actually, if folks know and realize that they are a member and they actually can make decisions about their credit union, they will get more involved. It's not a bank. The money is not going to shareholders. You are the shareholder. You have the agency. But most of us, if we have at a credit union, we're probably not taking advantage of that because we've been taught, and it is not to the power brokers elite. It's not to their advantage for us to understand those places and spaces where we have power and understand it, because then I think people would, and they actually, during the crisis just recently with all that was going on with the pandemic and the civil unrest, credit unions grew twofold because people left banks and came to credit unions because of that. Because inside of activist communities, there was some conversation. So that's just one little piece, just talking a little bit more about the agency that you can have inside of a shared ownership structure, which, yeah, I'll just stop there. You see what my passion is. I just get so excited when I talk about the possibilities and then what already exists that we don't know.
Yeah, what are the possibilities for our audience at Centering Justice is folks that generally are connected with nonprofit organizations. And I think some of us are scratching our heads about, and grappling with the seemingly paradoxical, realities of being in it and wanting to dismantle it, but one of the real challenges, and this isn't, I'm gonna make a statement, but help me if I pull out the question, because I think it has to do with how money flows.
Mhm.
So one of the points of intersection of our work was at a period of time in the early 2000s when social enterprise became like the latest fad, the thing, right? And nonprofits were trying to think about where there might be streams of earned revenue that would help them to diversify their funding portfolios.
Right.
Now, that was in direct response to the fact that they were at risk. They didn't have that financial resilience if they were largely relying on, grants or donors or the like. Where that got tricky was, who's the customer then? Right? If the, I'm gonna use some technical terms here that I don't mean to dehumanize, but like if the end user is someone who has limited means or access, then how do we keep fidelity to our mission and still derive earned income from somebody who can pay for it? And so a great example of this is a local organization open like a farmer's market, right? But they had to be able to prove that the farmer's market was mission aligned. Otherwise, they run the risk of being out of compliance with the IRS, right?
Mhm.
So ideologically, I think people believe our sector is the place to get good work done, and that the reality is just that good work has to be funded by, folk who have means. And part of that is because government has systematically pushed its work onto the sector, right?
Yeah.
But if I'm in a nonprofit and I'm like, okay, Yo D, you're right. It's a nonprofit industrial complex. It's terrible. We're not we're largely ineffective. We have more on us than we have the resources for. And I'm like, okay, well, then I'm gonna consider what Karen's over here doing, right? The co-op, like what moves people towards that might be reconsidering how they're organized in their structures? What are the benefits to that? And what are the barriers?
So I'm gonna say a few things. I often do this. I'm gonna try and do this and come right back to where you started.
Take your time, as the pastor would say. Preach, child.
Starting again with what I keep going back to the agency piece, there are only two institutions in the United States that actually are about and supporting workers. Those are unions and worker co-ops. That's it, right? So those are the spaces you can, that's what we currently have. Let me see, that's it right now in our country, period, right? So that tells us like there's not a lot of room for agency and other workspaces. You asked the question about, and actually repeat it one more time because I almost lost my train. I'm taking it down a road here, trying to get to the other side.
What are the benefits and what are the barriers for folk who are thinking about how to reorganize or restructure themselves into
Right.
some of the models that you lifted up?
So a nonprofit is a business, just like a co-op is a business and a LLC is a business. All these are all businesses. The difference is that the revenue code for the nonprofit is that those resources must be put back into the entity itself. There's no paying out of anybody, of shareholders, of workers, nothing. So that is the structure of it. And my thought is that it is still, as you say, it's a remnant, it is a construct that comes out of capitalism. Even though I'm working in it, I'm warm and fuzzy about the work that I'm doing, it still is a construct of capitalism. And it's structured as such, right? We talked about structure. I cannot say here that you can take your nonprofit and move it over to be a co-op. That's something that takes a little bit deeper thought. And the reason why I say that is in many cases, what we are doing, who will pay for it? And this gets back to your customer conversation. Who's gonna pay for it? So right now in our nonprofit industrial complex, we do have donors, whether they're grants or they're individuals, people with high wealth, whatever you got going on there that's supporting it. I actually just did a disrupting fundraising session yesterday with another group. Yeah, and it was talking about this and talking about over time and understanding who you want to be funded by, like what do you want it to look like, where you are, and then mapping your way there. It's a process, it is not fast. So I don't have, but there's no through line that I can see that's, oh, you can just become a co-op. The co-op itself, when you think about it, or a community-based enterprise that's owned by the community, can be structured where people are investing. Now I'm going to get into this world. Everybody knows about GoFundMe, about these platforms. Well, that actually was a result of some legal changes that allow individuals to invest in whatever on the same footing as somebody wealthy. And again, I don't want to, I'm not good at talking about this in a way that we all now can invest that we couldn't invest after that law was shifted. And that law was actually also came out of 1929 crash. So many people lost their money. They put people in classes. You had to have this much, you have to have this much money. And in order to be this class of person to invest, when most of us didn't have it. So we aggregated our stuff to invest. That's how they bifurcated the system. So there was a pushback on that all along, and that resulted in what we have now. So all these platforms you see are ways that we can aggregate our smaller resources and invest and not be afoul of the law. So communities can use, I use that platform because people understand it. They can use that system of aggregation of resources to try and get a community, whatever you're trying to do in your community. We talked to one group that was looking at housing and how they might be able to do that. There is a way to do that. Again, you don't see it much in Detroit. There are a few places on the east side. Little shout out to Maggie DeSantis, who God knows how many years ago tried to do that kind of work in community before her time. There's no straight line from nonprofit to community owned, but you certainly can envision, I would say, frankly, well, I don't want to get so radical. You might want to just build what you're trying to build and not try and retrofit anything, because retrofitting is way harder than just building what you're going to build. So put your eye on whatever it is that you're trying to do, even the organization that you're in, and walk it through that way first before you try a retrofit, right? Because again, the system is structured. Nonprofits are not structured for you to thrive. They're set up to sort of sweep up the things that capitalism has created. Markets that don't work, you got to feed the poor, you have a nonprofit, right? So you could think of a co-op filling the gap, or a CBE, a community-based enterprise, filling the gap, creating something like the community supported agriculture, right? Like a food co-op, filling those market gaps, but in a different structure so that you don't have the constraints even of a nonprofit. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. Yeah, I mean, for me, the invitation there, which makes a lot, I mean, I may not have framed the question best, because I am still curious and exploring here. How do we even bring the values of just transition into our organization, right? So for us, that can look like, we have for the last several years that one of our core values is investing in our people, our clients, and our communities. So where are we moving our resources to beyond just the doors of this organization? That includes, are we hiring locally? Who are the vendors we're working with? Do they represent the impacted communities that we serve? So I don't think it's an all or nothing. I think that I agree with you in terms of trying to retrofit. And in fact, that urban farming organization that I mentioned was, at one point, they were so frustrated that they were like, it would just be easier for us if we closed and restarted as a new entity, right? Because they're sort of locked in. But, and they found some wraparounds, and I'm really pleased. I mean, they had to do policy and advocacy work to get SNAP benefits in farmers markets so that folks who were accessing SNAP could buy fresh foods, right?
Yeah,
so there are so many ways that there's so many systems to interrupt. That my invitation would be, and I'd love to hear it from you. I mentioned a couple things, but like, what are some practices of cooperative being, of, what are some of the practices that show up beyond just the worker owner relationship? Is there a worldview or a set of values? I think you've hinted to a lot of this, but what might our nonprofit clients be thinking about? We're advising them on, leadership transitions and equitable pay, and putting some closing gaps between the top, ranking folks in the organization, and or between top leaders and not, were you gonna say something, Hamida? And workers that have not ascended the ranks. Watch me
No, I was really
stumble
thinking,
over
what
words.
you were sharing, I was thinking about also financial chasms, right? Between sort
Right.
of thinking of like what an ED or a leader should be paid, 5, 6, 10 times what other folks who are employees or staff members or workers. Yeah. So I was thinking about the financial gap too.
Oh, absolutely. And again, all those numbers, all those data points, a lot of times it was created for the system that we're actually trying to change.
Mhm.
And it was again, I can go down so many rabbit holes there. I'm going to come back to something that's very tangible. What I'm going to stick with right now, because it's so tangible, is just how do you make decisions together? That
Mhm.
is one that you can start wherever you are, no matter what you're doing, no matter what the structure of where you are. If you want to really get at it, is thinking about how you're currently making decisions, and then how you can start transitioning that. Because when you're in a democratic organization, you have shared power with one person, one vote. So I, as executive director, don't hold the power, and the board chair doesn't hold the power. So you can start with transparency of what your system is, right? Just to start. Be clear about how decisions are getting made, and be open about this is how it is. And it could be that right now there is a hierarchy in place, but your first step is just to show what it is, so that you could begin to shift it and say what you're going to shift, right? So, and one of the things that we have utilized in our organization, again, our founder brought this in, as sociocracy. It's just one of many ways of making decisions as a group. And I just want to throw that at something very tangible that anybody at any point can do, and start moving towards that transition. Because again, culturally, societally, nationally, we don't teach that in schools. We don't teach it in business school. We don't teach it how to make decisions collectively. Is not something you typically learn nowadays in the way we do things. So you have to be intentional and thoughtful to move in that direction. So there's a lot I could say, Yodi, but you said tangible. So that's like,
That
boom.
was perfection. And so simple too, which, sometimes some of these concepts can feel like a big bridge to cross over.
Yeah.
So I love just the invitation to think about, I talk about it like, where is power? Where's decision making? And power for me is about who gets to decide,
Mhm.
right? And oftentimes we've inherited these really hierarchical structures and paradigms related to that. I'm going to try to find, while we move to our next question, a resource for leaders around decision-making frameworks and how we can be transparent. It doesn't mean that we abdicate our responsibility to make decisions. I have certain fiduciary responsibilities to this organization, but there are many, many, many more decisions that I don't need to make, or that I could make transparent to people so that they're aware of it. So I'll see if I can get my hands on that. If not, Carly will include it. And then, yeah, Hamida put in the chat, shout out to Atten Bridges, who was our guest. Adam's down in North Carolina, but he's a sociocracy facilitator. And same thing, he was like, the power is in the people.
Mhm.
Part of the narrative of oppression is to exhaust us and to make us feel disempowered, or to use, as you said, both policy and narrative to shift what we're focused on.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a tool, and I'll have to give you a link that I continue to use. I took a training a long time ago called Collaborative Leadership, and I loved it. It literally went they had a visual and everything about how you make decisions collectively and transparently, and they identified them, like decide and announce. This is gonna happen, I'm doing it tomorrow. Boom. And then there's gather some input, and then I decide. Then there's gather input with discussion and vote, or some kind of way of people saying me, no, yes, no. And then there's a whole consensus right? Building, but each one, again, I kept it was a training and they gave you this little book and I use it to this day because it helps me keep clear on what I'm doing. Like you say, I'm executive director, so I can show up and say, I am deciding and announcing, and that's not inclusive. I get it. And sometimes you're forced to do it inside of the box that we're inside of in the nonprofit world, right? But at least I can say what it is. And I also can ask people, how are you making that decision? Which way are you going to use? Just say it up front. People can agree with you or not agree with you about the process, so that you understand that's a process question, not the decision question. So just getting clarity on that. So I will find that resource and give it to you, because it's something you can just see and touch and feel and utilize. Boom.
Please do. Please send it in. With your permission, we'll forward it along with citation to the audience. Something you said, I just dropped a link to some of our friends wrote a workbook, Embracing the Gifts of Conflict. And I think the decision-making framework is really important. And if folks click on that link, you'll see exactly what you described, like even just telling people how decisions get made and inviting, right? This is how we're going to make a decision is incredibly helpful. Sociocracy leans a lot, as you know, on consent as opposed to consensus.
Right.
And what Atten talked about is even when we say we're engaging people, we still stand at the front of the room and talk at them, right? Even when we're at the community meeting, or in the staff meeting, we're generally not getting those voices. So decision-making frameworks are super important, and communicating how. Then I was going to say something else and it slipped my mind. So that must be quiet for a second.
So Yoti, as you were sharing, I want to get in there and put
conflict. Can I say it? Because it came to my mind.
Yes.
Cultivating our ability to hold generative conflict, because working in this way with consent, with agency, with more voices and more people is not easy. Trust and believe that the systems that are working are benefiting those who are enacting them. It's easier to make unilateral decisions, including for myself, right? It's harder to invite everybody in and it takes more time, right? So it doesn't mean that it's more effective. And that's the other thing that Atten really blessed me with, is he was like, expediency does not mean efficacy. It doesn't mean impact. And so an antidote to that urgency, an antidote to that right to comfort that is consistent with our cultural norms in this country, the antidote to this individualism or single leader, charismatic leader dynamic is this, but we need to understand how to hold conflict in order to do it well. And the fact that open conflict is often not embraced unless it's violent in this country means that most of us are under-practiced in that. Just how we fight, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, right?
Absolutely. I just want to say amen to that one.
Amen. Go ahead.
Somewhat connected to that conflict, I think about the ways in which sometimes we can inadvertently, I'll use I statements here, I can inadvertently manufacture conflict. So as part of Sociocracy, please go check out that episode of CJ that Carly put in the chat, because it was incredible. I feel like I need to rewatch it, because one of the concepts that Atten talked about, and to Yoti's credit, like even when it gets tricky with our team, she's like, I'm using fist of 5. And some of us are like, what was that again? But I think about how, if we think about like the tenets of white supremacy culture, there's this like either or thinking. And I look back earlier in my career when often questions were framed as a yes or a no. Are we going to do this? Or are we not going to do this? Do you support? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And I think about the ways in which when we pull apart or like drop away opportunities to hold nuance, that can manufacture conflict. And nuance can be like, kind of exploring one specific facet of something, or it can be like, yeah, I don't feel the way, but like, we can do it. I don't love it, but it's not awful. But this notion of like fist of 5, where it's sort of like a Likert scale or a scale of like, resonance with the concept. 5 could be like, I love it, it's amazing, let's do it yesterday. And 3 is sort of like, I'm ambivalent, that's cool. Like I can go either way. Like I'm not opposed, but I'm not for either. And 2 and below are sort of like 2 is like, I need to talk about this some more. Like, no. And then 1 is like, no, thank you. This is a hard no. Like this is going to be my hill. But I think about both professionally and frankly, personally. I think about how holding space for those multiple ways where it's not like I'm going to agree or disagree to go to like have Indian for dinner tonight. And I use that because that's when I don't feel like cooking, that's what I'll get. But I think about what it means to like hold the different nuances of, is there a I can live with that? Same with, we're in budget season right now. Like I finished my draft yesterday and I feel it's real big, y'all. A little nervous. And I think about, what are some things where like it's a 5, like this must live in the budget. But there's some things where I'm like, I was being a little extra there too. Like, it's a 3, like I can release that, to where if someone on the team is like, hey, we should have, I've been using Unicorn Bouncy House as an example. Actually, it sounds kind of cool. But like, if I can't rationalize that for the budget, I'd be like, I dig you, friend, but maybe that won't make it, right? So how do we hold those different spaces of tension where it's not just like a, I agree or I disagree? It's like, I can live with.
I mean, I think you have already outlined it. It's just using those tools. You have to employ them. And I'm not going to say that I do this all the time 100%, because it is hard, and we are wired in the capitalist way that time equals money. Like that's the equation that we're hardwired. Even if we don't think like that, that's what's driving it. Because if it's not happening fast, you're wasting somebody's money, right? So to your point, Yodi and Hamida, it sometimes does force you to slow down. And I can point to specific times, and even in my own career, that makes it really difficult for me. And I gotta sit with myself, because when we usually do a round about whether we take on a project or not, if one person says, 2, I'm not there, everything stops, because you cannot move forward if you have somebody over there. And I know, I can see, that just it flies in the face of how we even think about everything in the country. I mean, around this table, we've been folks around this table right this minute. We've been in this space trying to figure this out. I don't think I have anything more to add to that. I mean, I'm just sort of saying, that's a big vociferous yes, you're right.
What about, so there are, Hamida and I have described, as we often do on purpose, we share the practices that we have at New, and we try to do that in a transparent way so that our community can access the lessons we've had and the failures and successes. But there are a number of workers in organizations that are not healthy, that are extractive, and we've seen an uptick in unionization. And I don't know if that's something you are prepared to chat about a little bit as we wrap up, the value of unions in thinking about community-based enterprise work, and thinking about
Well,
this conversation today. Can you talk about that a little bit, Ken?
I think I'll go back to something I said earlier about there's only 2 institutions in the United States that are really, their job is in support of the worker, and that is unions and worker ownership.
Yeah.
Those things can cohabitate as well, then they're not
Okay.
mutually exclusive. So that's probably my biggest thing. Yes, the uptick in unions is because that's a known institution and a way to go when you're realizing you have no agency where you work. That is one of the first things you go to. And then what we've been talking about today is another way, lesser known in that space. So that's really my biggest contribution, is just really lifting that up again. If you think about it, you don't really have rights in the workplace. The workplace was not created to be democratic in the United States. That's why most places you can be moved out of your job for any reason somebody decides.
That's at will.
That's at will. And even with all the permutations, However, the power wants to box up why that happens is very easy to do. Let me just say, you can move down very easily. So, because it's not designed for you to have power. It's not the purpose of it. So when
Yeah.
you see what's happening, it's just not designed for you to have power. So,
So short of organizing, although, we certainly think that folks should have agency in deciding, one of the just practical things to support our workers that we shifted away from was the carryover from corporate, and that was performance reviews. They tend to reinforce very objective standards of what success looked like. And they're very much tied to capitalism and to producing, as you say. Rarely do those reviews, are they just all glowing? And here you go, here's a bunch of money for your hard work last year. Mostly they have to have something you got to improve upon, because behind them is also resources that, at least in my experience working in other places besides New, it was expected that I wasn't going to give everybody all the money, that I was protecting the company to some degree. And so for us, at least, it was more cultural. Like, there are other ways to create a culture of feedback and accountability and support that don't tether people's performance to their pay. Right? You still got to perform. Don't get me wrong. There are high levels of expectation, but it's not tied to, do you get a raise?
I couldn't agree more. I have nothing to add to that, because yes, I agree. I mean, yeah, when you're making those decisions yourself, you can contemplate all of that and structure it however you think it needs to be structured. I've been paying attention to a particular co-op in Detroit, Pingree, Detroit, and they really have a wonderful way of how they structured everything in the whole culture of that organization. They have regular in the morning huddles where people come, and they have different people leading those huddles every morning about what the issues are of the days. It's just even down to how they do their budgeting. Doesn't look like a traditional budget. It's an accessible budget. And that's another thing about making sure that everybody understands what's in the budget, what's happening there. And then you're transparent about the decisions you're making that impact the budget, so that people can then weigh in informed, right? They can weigh being informed about it, not just saying, what is this? What are you talking about? Or just saying, like you say, yes or no, and you haven't even put anything, they don't have anything to look at. Just make a decision when you don't understand the impact. So that's another piece that comes into play, is open book management. Have you heard that? Or open book financials, where you make sure that everybody can read them however you have them put together, so that then they can look at them and make decisions out of whatever, understanding what's happening in the organization.
Yeah.
More
All right,
tools.
sorry, I'm trying to like multitask right now. Thank you, Carly, for letting me know that we missed a question from Tom.
Oh,
We're looking into an EOT model for our small company, employee ownership trust. That seems to be the best fit for us. Curious any perspectives that anyone can share on this model.
so yes, our organization, we've done one of EOTs, and it is a nice model, because this is getting into the technicalities of the structure, but it's easier to do when you have a smaller organization. It's less costly. It's usually compared to an employee stock ownership plan, an ESOP type entity, and that's going down the technical rabbit hole. But it's a much better financial advantage. I just gotta say, hats up to just even talking about it and bringing it up as that you would love to do that. And we get the EOT. It comes out of actually the way, again, England, and I'm not holding it up as the great country, but they have an infrastructure of cooperatives and a system and that EOT that we are now starting to use in the United States. We picked up some of those, we looked at some of the rules and regs from the UK in order to create them. But I think it's a great way to think about if you're a smaller, like I would say if you're under 100 people in your entity, your organization, it's a nice way to think about it, about transitioning over. More than that, I'd have to know more details, but that's what I'll say right now. But again, I'm so excited to hear somebody even ask that question.
Yeah, there's some good. Tom said, thanks. We are under 20 in our company. And Tom, hope you'll reach out to Karen and the folks at C2BE. Hamida did drop that in the website in the chat, but Carly will send that out. Jenny said, I know one of the founders of Pingree from social justice community in Detroit recently ran into him and he apologized for not being active. I told him he was active. He was doing it with Pingree. I'll share with him how they came up. Thanks so much, Jenny. We hope you'll do that. And I'm excited to meet them. So if somebody could make an introduction, that would be fantastic. Alyssa said, double fist excitedly in the air for today's info sharing. We're so happy to hear that. Folks, stay in touch. In the spirit of cooperation, we do extend a survey. We want to design our season and our episodes with you in mind. I would love it if 20 of y'all all 27 of y'all completed today's survey. It would mean a lot. It takes literally 5 minutes and it has 5 years of lasting impact. I can tell you that. Karen, not only was this everything we hoped for, but I'm like, can I sit at your feet to hear some more? I'm going to think about what that looks like, what it means for us, and I hope others will too, what it means for us to be operating in an ecosystem with thought leaders like you, with folks who are plugged into these networks of people that are values aligned and are pro-worker and care about the folks in our communities. It's been a delight for sure.
It's been an honor to be here and for you even to have the Centering Justice. This is a beautiful thing. And I have shared the link everywhere for all of them. Thank you for inviting me in.